3, 1, 2, 3. Am I getting anything? I don't even know. Oh wait, it looks like yes I am. It looks like I've got some sound coming in. Testing to see. It sounds like I've got them coming in now. Perfect. Alright, if anybody out there can hear me, just give me maybe a thumbs up in the chat. Make sure you can hear me so I know. And then we'll get started in a little bit. I've got one other way to check, which is go to YouTube myself and sign in here. So actually, let me do that right now. Let's see. Got one other way to check, which is go to YouTube. There I am. All right, cool. It's kind of funny. I see myself on the screen. Alright, well now that I know you guys can definitely hear me, my name is Saxon. Hello again and welcome to the second Thursday of the month. In today's camera class we're going to be doing intermediate cameras. So I'll gear everybody up in a little bit for that. But we're now graduating from our point and shoot from our first video, which was really just going over how to use the camera with an automatic setting. And now we're going to really get into depth about how you can go about using things like your aperture priority or your shutter priority or even full manual if you choose so. So give it a few more minutes here, a little bit more time, and then we'll jump into it. But thanks everybody for joining. I'm excited to get started. Let me go close my door. I don't have anybody present today in class, just my online viewers. Pardon me. But we'll have a good class. We'll get really into it. So yeah, thanks for signing on everybody. Give me a few minutes to get started. Alright, let's get started here now. So everybody, thank you again and welcome intermediate camera class. So let me jump to the first page over here and then we'll get started. So first things first, one thing I feel like we should just talk about right off the bat. Why go advanced point and shoot DSLR or mirrorless? I put my phone in my pocket because I didn't want to be surrounded with it, but might as well show right now. We have this in our pockets. Almost for everybody out there, unless you're still using a flip phone, you have some form of smartphone that has a really intelligent and advanced camera. So the question I get asked all the time here in our store here in the camera department is why go advanced point and shoot DSLR or mirrorless camera? What is the point when we have something so powerful in our pockets? And I guess the main function, and something that we kind of touch base in the very beginning of my intro to cameras, is a cell phone does not equate to a camera, and in the same sense, a camera does not equate to a cell phone. The phone has the capability of being quick. I like to think of the idea of a cell phone as a snapshot. It's a great way for you to take a photo of something in a quick manner, so that way you have it for reference. Myself, I don't necessarily practice photography as an art form. I'm a painter, I'm a drawer, I also make my own books. One of the things that I constantly do is when I catch inspiration or I see something, I don't have a DSLR, I don't have a mirrorless camera around my neck every day. I use my phone to take those pictures. Now when I'm on vacation, or my friends need headshots, or maybe I am in the mood to take pictures of past artwork that I've done, while as tempting as it is to grab my phone because it's there, it's readily available, and it's very easy to use, the camera and the photo quality that I get on there, as far as to the file format, size, and shape, it's not nearly as advanced as a camera. There's a lot of specs and a lot of stats out there, but that's one of the big things I always talk about. If you take a picture on a DSLR, mirrorless, or point-and-shoot camera, and you transfer that to your computer, then move it to your phone, the difference in the quality that you're going to see from taking one of your photos on your phone and texting it to a buddy versus having this beautiful picture from a DSLR, mirrorless, or point-and-shoot camera, the difference is night and day. And when you send those out, you'll see the difference right away too. And that's just one example, but there's many more that we could really touch on and go through. But why go advanced point-and-shoot DSLR mirrorless? I think to sum it all up is that it's for the person who wants to get the best image quality possible for their money. Anybody who's trying to beat out an iPhone in the current market, you're anywhere between about $800 to $1,000 as your entry-level camera. No, it is not a cheap investment. It is not something that's easily accessible for some, but when you make that jump and you make that investment, you will see the difference between the camera and the phone, and the more you practice and the more that you learn, the better that you'll become with the differences. So snapshots versus photographs, I've said it in the very beginning. A snapshot is quick. It's meant to be a quick and fast motion. So my example here is what I call a snapshot. This would have been something that would have been primarily done on a phone. If you are using a camera, you're not really putting a lot of thought into it. Snapshot is just exactly what it is. It's a snap and a shot. You're just real quick taking whatever device it is, whether it's a camera or a phone, and you're just taking a quick photo just to get something in for whatever information that you need. Could be a funny thing, could be for reference for later. For me, a lot of the times when I'm taking snapshots on my phone, it's meant for me to use as a reference point to jump off of on a later project. Now we have a photograph. And the idea with here was we can see the time and everything else that goes into it. We can see the, I don't want to say preciseness, because there is some areas where the photo could use a little bit of work, but we can see the thought, the intentionality. The ISO was brought a little bit lower, so we have more shadows in the photo. The light on the ceiling is emphasized a little bit more, so we have a beautiful color that's coming down, and that color reflects on the metal of the escalator, and the camera is able to pick up all of that. So what we have here that we don't necessarily have in the other is detail, it's color, it's saturation, it's depth. We have a lot of information on this photograph that makes us feel something a little bit more. Now, if anyone knows where this is here at Apt Electronics. It's on our left side, or depending on which way you go, but if you're facing the fountain, it's on the right side escalator, or if you're facing towards the door, it's on the left side. But regardless, this takes you up to the second floor to our mattress and furniture department, and I feel like the color and everything else on this is true to life on this photo versus this one, which feels a little bit more stagnant and bland. Again, it's all about the way that the device is being used, and in this case of the camera, we're using it to its full potential in order to get a photograph versus that snapshot. So the first thing I always recommend to every single person out there is please learn your camera. That's one of the first things that we cover in the Intro to Photography video. We really go over what it means to learn the camera, learn the device that you're using, but then also go beyond that to ask questions. Once you learn how the device works and where buttons are and where everything is, now the question is, how does that go into my practice, and how do I use this when I'm trying to get the photos that I want? And that really is all determined by you. I sell cameras all the time, and I have people that have never used anything other than auto. Again, they don't really care to do anything else. They just know that the camera will be better than their phone, better than anything else that they've had, and they stay on automatic. Some people don't necessarily need to learn the buttons, but what I always tell people is if you learn the camera first, you can learn right away what you need and what you don't need, and from there kind of find your happy middle ground. So first step, always learn the camera. Know where the buttons are located, know terminology. The worst thing that could happen is that you're out somewhere and somebody asks you questions, or you ask somebody else who's professional or someone who's more experienced questions, and they start naming things that are over your head. A lot of the times the only reason that's over anyone's head is because we're just not up to date with the terminology, and I feel like anybody who's getting into cameras should try to grasp an understanding. I put this picture up, or these multiple photos, because I like to explain. There are, pardon me, I've got a little bit of water here to keep me awake. I always get yawny when there's no students here in front of me. I put all these pictures on here to really show that there are so many different cameras. You can have any model out there. It's always important at square one in the beginner's class to learn the camera first. It's step one. Now, let's get into a little bit more of a technical thing. When you're starting to shoot, you probably don't question this, but as you become more skilled, you're probably looking at the image quality, sizes, and you're looking at settings right now to get an idea of either aspect ratio, image quality, video quality, whatever it is, and you might see the terms JPEG and RAW. What does that mean? So let's start with a JPEG. That's going to be your standard photo, and that's the one that's in the center. If we go to the left, we have a RAW. And then if we go to the right, we have a processed RAW. Now, a JPEG image is a compressed file. It usually comes in at a certain megabyte size depending on the image size, so if you have a small, medium, or large JPEG. But then the second thing is that its color, its tone, its shadows, they're all standard. It's whatever the camera saw is really what you get. Now with a RAW photo, it comes in a little bit differently. Now typically, this is a much larger sized file. Again, depending on what it is and what camera you're using, that can really dictate the actual RAW size that you're looking at. When we look at the JPEG, we see more color, we see wrinkles in the shirt, we see a lot more information. Now, I have it on my screen on my left, so if I look to the left, that's where I'm looking right now. And as I've said earlier too, if anybody has questions, just chat away. Now if we look at the JPEG in the center there, what we're going to notice is we'll see wrinkles, we'll see everything on the person's shirt. We're going to see highlights on the skin, coloration with the arm shadows that are underneath. But it's a flat image for the most part. Not a lot of depth to it, not a lot of need to understand. What we have is what we get. When we see the RAW next to it, that is a bigger file, but the photo itself looks muted. There are really no overly dark spots. There's no perfect black. There are less details and less shine on something like his wrist or on his arm. And when it comes to the sunglasses, we don't get as much reflection or as much information. Now, move all the way to the right and we have a processed RAW. And the processed RAW is really nice because now, when you compare the JPEG and the RAW, you see more depth inside the processed RAW. When we look at his forehead, we can clearly see highlights on the side. When we look at the shirts, we have more information on the cross-chest area here, where we have more wrinkles that are going in different directions, causing the shirt to be 3 or 4 different colors of black. The sunglasses have more of an intense shine to them. The microphone has a little bit more attention drawn to it. The guitar, the hand, the guitar strap, all has more coloration, more detail to it. So what you get from a JPEG versus a RAW. JPEG is a compressed file. It's very easy to shoot with JPEG. I recommend most people start with JPEG. If you have no interest in editing, you want the photos straight out of the camera as is with no difference, then stick with JPEG. It's a great image. It'll work for most people, and it's one of those images that you can easily send to your family, friends to see the image. If you want to put this on social media, you can do that with a JPEG, no problem. RAW, on the other hand, you've still got a little bit of information with the RAW. It's a bigger file, and most places don't accept a RAW file to be sent. So if you try to text a RAW, maybe put it on social media, it might not go through. You have to eventually convert it into another type of file. Typically, in this case, a processed or a JPEG would then become necessary. But processed RAW will give you the ability to run it through all of the different color correction and changes via something like Adobe Photoshop or photo editors that are built into the computers for Mac or Dell or Mac or PC. So overall, if you're someone who's interested in doing post work, you want to edit photos, you want to play with video, you want to really make sure that the coloration of whatever photo or whatever it is that you're taking is what you want it to be, Process RAW is a really great way to go. Now, editing software to do that. I mentioned again that both Mac and PC Windows users will have availability to free or yeah, it would be free because my Mac has it for free as well. They're free editors. They're nothing fancy. They're very run-of-the-mill, and they should give you both about the same features, just different layouts as far as iOS and PC are concerned. Now, or OS with Mac. Now, when we look through, I always recommend that it's important you look at other forms of editing software because while I like those, they're very basic, they're simple. Photoshop. One of my personal favorites. It has every tool under the sun. It's been tried and tested by artists of all shapes, sizes, and colors. It is honestly probably the #1 photo editing app in the entire world. It is a great, great resource and worth having. If you don't, I strongly recommend it. But with Photoshop, what we're getting is the ability to go through and edit photos and really go and have different details to them. If we want to remove something from a photo, we can. If we want to darken an area up, we can. If we want to crop something out, if we want to cut a background away, we can do all of that. And that's the beauty of Photoshop. Underneath that is one of the PC programs. It's meant to look like layers of a photo. That's what those squares are meant to be. If you're not familiar with layers, the second that you download one of these apps, they should explain how layers and how the layering system works. And then to the right, I have another one. I believe that's DaVinci. It is a video editing software, but from what a lot of my colleagues and friends have told me, they do have a really nice photo editing software, I believe, included with it. So definitely worth checking out. But definitely, if you're someone who is interested in shooting in RAW because you want to then edit photos, you definitely want to look into a different editing software like this. Nothing wrong with the average Mac or PC editing software, but it's definitely not going to be as complicated, nor is it going to be as thorough as something like this. From there, let's talk a little bit about the mode dial before we talk. So last week we really prefaced that auto is the way to go when you're first starting. Why auto? Because the camera will do all the work for you. Why do we want the camera to do all the work? Because in reality of photo taking, before we become more advanced or intermediate, the camera is smarter than us at taking photos. It knows how to read light and movement and speed and tracking, and because of that, it'll offer a much better experience for the new goer rather than just going right to manual. I have so many people that try to start with aperture settings or shutter priority or manual, and they get very frustrated. They don't understand why this isn't doing what they want to do. It's a very hard thing to explain to somebody that they're just not ready for the next step on that one yet until they really fully understand what it is that auto is doing. A lot of people will first move into a manual setting because they want to control it. They don't really understand what it is that they're controlling, and they don't understand how what they're seeing in front of them equates to what their camera settings should be. So it's very important. Understand the mode dial. When you're just beginning, stick with auto, and then eventually when you get more comfortable, I always recommend do manual last. Learn aperture and shutter priority first, and then manual. And we're going to talk about all of those things in some of the next slides. So your next steps when it comes to the mode dial, you have automatic. That means that everything is auto. You don't touch anything. It does it all for you. Program auto means you can set things to be auto. You can set things not to be auto. It's up to you. It's your choice. What's really nice is you can set and go from there and decide if you want one setting to be automatic or if you want all settings to be automatic. Every time you go back to P, which is program, it should do the same exact settings that are left off for you. Aperture priority. Aperture is the metal shutters of the camera and how those are opening to allow light into the physical device. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Shutter priority is the speed at which the shutters are closing and then reopening to allow for that picture to happen. Full manual. Pretty self-explanatory. You do all the work, all the little itty-bitty parts. That is all up to you. So I said that I was going to talk about aperture and shutter, and we're going to do that. And we're also going to talk about ISO. What you'll hear in most terms is the exposure triangle. And I do love the idea of the exposure triangle. The idea is that you have a triangle in front of you. And at one tip you have aperture, at one tip you have shutter, and at the other tip you have ISO. And the idea is that the three work together in order for you to get the perfect image. And while that is true, I would say for most advanced cameras and for most time, it's not really necessary for to be on a triangle anymore. If anything, it's nice to have it in a row of information so you can really break down and understand what does all this mean. So, without further ado, let's start with our aperture priority. So aperture priority works like this, and I like to explain it like a human eyeball. If you took your eye out and you put it in front of you, you'd see that there is a color that is associated with your eye that is surrounded by white. And in the very center of your eyeball, you've got this black dot. Now, this black dot will get really big and get really small. It gets really small when we are surrounded with light. Light's pouring into our eyes, so our iris, to compensate for that amount of light, smallens our iris, so we let less light in. Helps our receptors, helps everything else, helps our vision. It's a natural instinct that our eyes have, and our pupils are the best show of how that works. When we want, when we are in the dark and we are, let's say, in the basement, no light, you're going to notice that your iris gets really big and it becomes almost the entire part of your eye. This is because the iris itself is going to be it's what lets our light in. It's our reception for how light comes into our eyes. Cameras work very similar, except the only difference is it's not allowing to how dark the photo is going to be versus how light the photo is going to be. It refers to foreground to background separation. When we have our smallest of our numbers, meaning that we have a tiny, tiny, tiny dot, or sorry, we don't have a tiny dot, we have a wide open shutter, we get great foreground to background separation. What that basically means is that when we hold this camera out towards our subject, we are able to separate them or that thing from whatever its background and other information is. So, and before I jump, and when we look at the opposite end of that, at 22, we see a very tiny hole and we can see the pyramid and we can see this person in front of it. So the best way to describe this is the smaller the number, the more blur you will have on your background from your foreground, and the less blur that you have, the more the smaller, the higher the number, the more information that the camera is going to pick up. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're shooting your next project. What is this person standing in front of? Does the background necessarily matter for my image? Am I just focusing on the subject themselves and not really pushing anything else? That's all part of it. But going through 1.4, we see no background. F2, we're starting to see a little bit more. F3, we now can make out that it's a triangle if we couldn't before. F4, 5, and F4 and 5.6 are basically the same. Now we're getting more dark. F8, now we're starting to see that the pyramid's coming back to life as far as that other side is concerned. It's not as light anymore. 11, 16, and 12 all look great. Except for 11, I would say there's still a little bit of motion and blur on there. But overall, that's what you're looking at when it comes to f-stop. It is going to be the iris, or that little black dot that then, or I'm using it for the eyeball sense, but it's basically where those metal shutters are coming in at, and then where they're opening to. That's your f-stop. Examples of f-stop. So in this one I have the dog's nose. It's a nice close-up picture. If we look at the dog's nose, we see it in really good detail. We can see the hair on the whiskers, even a little bit of water there. But when we look at the dog in the background, it's blurred. We don't really see the dog in full detail, but the dog is there, and we can make out that that is a dog. So if I were to go back to my chart and say, what does that look like? I probably would say it's an F11 or an F8. Going back, I'd say that's about right. Our background to foreground separation is good, but we don't necessarily have a lot of it, but we have a good amount. And the dog in the background is, again, not in full focus or in detail, but we can still see it. Moving over to our squirrel, we have a lot more blurring going on. Now, given that we can see the color and everything else of its surrounding, we can kind of make out that this is a tree, that they're probably on top of a log or a branch, that this photographer is able to get a photo that close is pretty cool. But we can see that the background itself is green, but not legibly. So we know what this is just based on maybe past experience or what we've seen, but we don't know maybe where or how. This I would probably put towards maybe an F2 or an F2.8, where yes, we don't necessarily know what the background is, but we can make it out in most case scenarios. So it's definitely not a 1.4 or a 1.2. Another example of us using our aperture priority, here we have our main character from the Lego movie, Emmett, I believe, and on top of that, Emmett is sitting in front of some lights. Now, the funny part about this, and this is a trick within the photography world, is we can see that this is probably an f-stop of 1.4 to 1. My apologies. We can either see that this is 1.8 or 1.4. The nice part about this one is that we have these dots in the background, and those dots are called bokeh dots. Bokeh is an effect that happens on the camera when you lower the aperture, lower the aperture to a certain point, letting the iris of the camera be wide open. The camera is able to pick up on what it is focusing on. So if you're focusing on Emmett, the little Lego figure, it'll focus on him. But if you start to focus at the lights, it'll focus on the lights and blur out Emmett. In this case, we focused on Emmett, the Lego character, and we still took the photo, which means that the dots in the background are there, they're present, but they're not necessarily in full focus, nor are they in full saturation. And because of that background to foreground separation, we now have all of our attention being drawn to Emmett, less of our attention being drawn to the background. But we have beautiful dots that are help illuminating our character, which also add a little bit of vigor, but offer some color, offer some just interesting information. Why use aperture priority mode? I get asked this when it comes to photography, and I have answers for both why using aperture priority and why using shutter. Aperture priority is a great tool to have if you aren't sure about what you're taking pictures of on a shoot. The way I describe it is, let's say that you're out in the field, you're taking photos, you're having a good time. Let's say that the missus goes in front of a tree. It's an ugly tree. You don't really want to get it in the background. It's a swamp behind you. Just none of it looks appetizing. A aperture priority of 1.2, 1.4 would be great because you'd be able to get that picture of her the way that you wanted to, and then you wouldn't have to necessarily worry about the background, goofing it up and making it look ugly. On the flip side to that, though, maybe you love the background. Maybe that's the whole part of why you wanted to take this vacation, was to get that photo with the background in the background. Background in the background. That's totally fine too. And what I would probably recommend for that one is using shutters, is the opposite side of the aperture priority, which is going to be the higher numbers, because we don't necessarily need to separate the background. So in a case like this photo that I have, for example, we have this lady, she's standing in front of a beautiful sunrise or sunset with the water behind her, a tiny village in the background. So using something like an aperture priority setting would be a really nice feature to something like this type of photo. Now to give you a little more context, F32, we've got the garbage can, greenery, and we can see it all. F16 starts to get a little hazy, we have no idea. F6.3, definitely darker. If you didn't have 32 or 16, I don't think you would really know what that is, so that's a really nice sign. But 2.8 is going to be your best, because now you really can't see the blue of the garbage can, and therefore all you see is the log. And I feel like with a watchful eye you could probably notice the greenery in the background and put 2 and 2 together. But having this stack of trees, the way that it's set up like this, I feel like gives it away a little bit more. But in reality, the photo itself would be so-so. I would say that this mainly is for the opportunity to show off those f-stops so people understand it a little bit better. But 2.8 would be a great example of a way for you to blur the background out to a certain point where now you can no longer see what's behind it. So again, strengthen the idea. If you're shooting and you want to use the aperture priority, why do you want to use the aperture priority? What is it that you're shooting? Do you need good foreground to background space? Does that even matter to you? It's an idea. Now shutter speed, we move to the next one. Shutter speed flip-flops. In the way that a higher number would lead to a smaller aperture, and that a lower number would lead to a much more wide open aperture, shutter speed works in a different way. The smaller the number, the faster; the bigger the number, the slower. So, or I apologize, flip-flop that. The bigger the number, the slower; the faster the number, or the lower the number, the faster. So when we start at 1/500ths, that shows a gentleman running, and it's supposed to show him running quickly, I would say. So 1/500ths should capture the runner in motion with little to no blur. As you move down the list, let's look at 160, 130. We can slowly start to see some blur on the figure, and we can tell that it's slowing down. The 1/125th going onward, we really see more squiggles, more movement. And then lastly, 1/2. Now we see a lot of movement. Now, the idea that you're probably asking is, why does this matter? Depends on the shooting that you're doing, and a lot of the times I get parents here in the store who are trying to take pictures of their kids' sports. Sports are great, love sports, grew up on them. Photographing sports can be a nightmare. And if you're someone who's not as familiar with the camera, you can really struggle from this kind of stuff. And so what I typically will recommend for fast action when you're trying to make sure that you get something in a not slow-mo shot, but let's say in the best detail possible, freezing action starts at 1/1000ths or faster. When we look at our chart over here, it's not even on there. We tap out at 1/500ths, but the idea is that the higher the number, the faster those shutters are going to go off. And so the lower the number, the slower they'll go. Now there's importance to doing slow shutter speeds, and we'll talk about that. That's called long exposure, and it works really well in certain circumstances. You can get some beautiful images out of that. But for most people, I'd say 90% of people, you don't necessarily need to go that slow, not unless you have at least a tripod. But the 1/1000ths is a freezing action. So for this case, we've got the surfer. The surfer's going, we can see him in clear detail. We see the waters kicking up, and there's a term when it turns that frothy white color versus the blue. I always forget what that's called. But when we look at the surfer's in perfect detail. We're not getting a lot of motion, we're not getting blur. Where are we getting the motion and the blur? On the water. Is it substantial? Not necessarily. You see this kind of white haziness around certain parts of the water, and that really, in my opinion, shows off what I'm talking about when I'm talking about getting motion, not necessarily perfectly still. But the main driving force of this photo would be our surfer guy. So from seeing this, what I'm picking up on this one is that the surfer's clearly in motion, most of the water's clearly in motion, and we can get a still image of that. And the areas that are still a little rough are those blue areas where the water seems to have more of a mist. I would definitely use this photo if I were trying to submit for a contest of any kind, especially for action. But it's important that we keep this in mind. We've got a lot of runners out there, soccer players. FIFA just finished not long ago. The football has been big, and we have some images to kind of show that off too. So again, if we're trying to freeze on a sport action, we want to be doing 1 in 1,000ths or faster. Giving a sense of motion. So another reason why we like shutter priority. This is a bigger thing when I was first learning how to draw properly and go through the motions of that. One of the hardest things to convey when you're doing a 2D art form or even a 3D art form is motion. How do you describe or show motion? Motion is the idea of movement. And so if you're taking a picture of something or drawing something, it's a still image, it's flat. So we're not necessarily, as a viewer, getting the sense of motion or urgency. When you show things that have shutter priority, a lot of the times you will catch glimpses of blur. And a lot of the times I get people who sit there and they tell me that blur isn't necessarily something they want to see on their photo, and I always ask them why. What is it about blur that you don't like? And a lot of the times it's because it looks ugly, it doesn't show the image properly, it's just not what they wanted. And I sometimes explain to people that blur in a lot of cases can be a very beautiful thing to keep in your photos. And this is a great example of one that I really like, this hummingbird here. When we look at the hummingbird, the physical bird, the body, the yellow, the end of the wings, more where that shoulder would be, the beak, all of the color is gorgeous on there. But where do we see our motion? Where do we see movement? In the wings. And we can see the blur in the wings. Now this is a perfect example of having a controlled blur that gives a sense of motion to this 2D image, so that when you show it and convey it to somebody else, you're giving somebody a sense of that same thing that you saw. If you've ever seen a hummingbird in action, you've been to the zoo, you've got one in your neighborhood, those things fly very quickly. Hummingbirds by nature, they have a very long beak. From what I understand, they suck nectar out of trees or out of plants, and so what they do is they go at such a fast rate with their wings that they basically can hover just at the plant or whatever it is level, stick their beak in, get the nectar, pollinate, whatever it is that they actually do, and then back up and boom, they're gone. They are a fast bird. So in order to get a picture like this requires a camera that has a good shutter speed, but this requires the person, the artist, using the correct shutter speed. Getting a picture like this, you probably only get one take at it. Now this is what I talked about when I was mentioning long exposure, saying that we get into it a little bit more. When you want to take a long exposure, this is on the opposite side of the shutter speed spectrum. So you have the 1 in 1,000ths over here. This is you trying to get motion. You got the surfer, you got the football player, the track star. Now you're on the opposite side. You've got the long exposure. You're with the tripod. You want to do slow shutter speeds. What you're doing here is setting the camera up on a tripod, and you're turning it to the bulb setting or the longest setting exposure you can. What this is then going to do is allow you, the photographer, to get a very saturated and colorful image. If you look at the greens on this picture, from the mold on the rocks to the moss on the rocks to the green shrubs in the very behind of the waterfall, all of that is clear, it's detailed, it has information there. The beauty of that is from the long exposure. The longer that your camera shutter stays open, the more information your camera has to absorb and pick up. So we can talk about megapixel sensors. We can talk about size of the sensors. We can talk about autofocus points. The one thing that can always beat something like that out is a long exposure photo. Now, the problem that we get with long exposure is movement. Movement is the killer to most photos, to most long exposure photos too. Where do we see the blur on this image? Well, if we look at the water and we look at the white rapids of the water, we can see that there's a haze around the whole thing, where it almost looks like the water was maybe photoshopped or dropped into the image. That is the movement that we're seeing, and because that movement differs with how water splashes and it moves everywhere, the motion around this whole thing feels very halo-like. It feels very sporadic. Again, that's because that's something that our camera with long exposure is picking up. Now, the fact that this waterfall is going continuously and it's hitting the same marks, the rocks behind the water, most of the big chunks of the water, all that's very clear. We can get that information with no problem. Same thing like the greenery, everything else. Because that's staying still and isn't moving, we're able to get that information and it's able to be absorbed by the camera's sensor, giving us a very highly saturated image that was a very long exposure. So when I say long exposure, I mean half a second. I mean three seconds. I mean 3/4 of a second. That's what I'm referring to with long exposure. If you were to take a regular photo and hold your thing out, that's a long time to leave those shutters open and closed. By the time you do that, you're going to notice blur. What I might say is, if you're really trying to learn about the shutter, aperture, and shutter priorities, turn them on your camera and play with them. Learn and see the difference right away when you set certain things. Look at how a 1.8 on your aperture looks different than a 32. Look to see how a half a second long exposure is different from a 1 in 500ths or a 1 in 100ths, more of a standard. Again, they differ, they look different, but there's different applications and purposes for that, and there's a reason why they're there on your camera. Another example of a long exposure, we have a gentleman standing in front of a train. If we look, we can see the bike is in perfect clarity, the gentleman is in perfect clarity, the train platform, the ceiling, all of that's great. What's moving? The train. Does the train look perfect? No, it looks like a stream of light. So honestly, if you weren't aware of long exposure in photography, you might think that that is just a cool display or it's an art piece, or they added that to it. But in reality, the person either working the camera behind the camera or this person who is taking a picture of themselves set the camera up on a tripod or a bench, set it for long exposure, probably has a remote in his hand of some sort, walked in front of by the train, hit the button, stood there, didn't move, let the train pass him, click the button again. That is allowing for the camera to take this long of a photo, which has beautiful color, has beautiful depth, has shadows, has saturation, tints, but then has this beautiful streak of lines going in front of them. Why use shutter priority? I think that this picture right here sums it up. If you're new to photography, you probably take a lot of photos that look like this. And why is that? It's because we're not using motion in the correct way. We have to remember and keep in mind and always consider motion when we're taking photos. How fast is the object moving in which I'm shooting? Is it moving so fast that I need to make sure that I'm going at a faster rate to get it? Is it moving super slow so I can take my time and get a much more detailed picture? It's all up to what you see. So for this case, I would definitely use shutter speed for ultimate frisbee, just because the movement of the disc, movement of the players is so sporadic. You definitely want to be able to have that as you're shooting and be able to capture it in a timely manner. Another reason why I might want to use shutter priority, we have this guy on a motocross here. He's doing some tricks. This is definitely done with 1 in 1,000ths or 1 in 1,500ths shutter speed. So this is a great example of a photo that could really benefit from a faster shutter speed. Why? Because this person's in motion, and so the time that you have to get this picture is smaller and smaller by the millisecond. Again, for someone like this guy who's doing tricks on a motorbike, I mean, how long is he actually in the air for? Let's say 3 to 5 seconds at most. You have 3 to 5 seconds to get that picture. Using shutter speed priority would be your best bet, but then using it at a very fast shutter speed would probably be the best bet for you. So 1 in 1,000ths, 1 in 1,500ths. Again, it's important. And then now we talk about ISO, which is the third factor on our exposure triangle. When we look at the numbers on here, we have 100, 200, 400, and 800. When we look at 100, it's a very dark picture. There's not a lot of detail, and we can't really make out the difference between shadows and what we're actually looking at. When we move to the 200, our sky becomes a little bit lighter. There's less shadows on the sky, less shadows on the water. We can start making out that that's maybe a sandy beach of some sort, and this is a pier, not just like some dock or just some random set of lines. The 400 one, now we start to see the wrinkles in the water. We see the ripples, we see the waves. We also start to see the sunlight a little bit more under the bridge. It's very bright, it's purpley, adds to the different color spectrums. We also can see the sand much more clearly. When we moved 800, now we have a very bright photo. Almost all the corners of the picture are light now. They're not as dark. And we can really make out all the information on both the waves, the sand, behind the pier itself, all that thing, all that. ISO is the amount of light and the sensitivity towards light that the camera has. The higher you turn your ISO, the higher sensitivity it'll have towards light. The lower you turn that ISO, the less sensitivity it has towards light. The reason that we do this setting is because we want to make sure, and a lot of the times too, our ISO is set to auto, but we can always change that and manually set our auto, whether in program, and I believe whether in Aperture and shutter priority. All brands are a little different, but I'm almost positive you can still set it. What's great about choosing your own ISO is the fact that you are in full control of how much light that the camera's letting in. For me personally, I shoot at a minimum of 800 ISO almost all the time. Sometimes I shoot at 600 ISO. Depends on where I'm at. I like more of a grainy picture. So the higher, that's like a nice middle tone or mid-tone high amount of light that it's letting in is the term I'm looking for. So it's not necessarily an overabundance where we have the camera oversaturating us with light. But, in my opinion, it leads the photo to be a tinge more grainy, which to me simulates more of the film. Because film was all about grain. It was all about the information that the picture is what you're able to get, and the amount of grain that you can then either get away from or get off of that photo. So when we look at certain numbers, and I'm going to go into the next slide here, and we'll talk more about ISO and how that all works. But the lower the count, the darker the photo. The higher the count, the lighter the photo. And there's a couple things that you'll sacrifice here and there. One of the things that you'll have to be aware of is ISO equates to noise. ISO and noise go very much hand in hand. So on the left side of our Empire State Building, we have the clean image, 100 ISO. The sun is out slightly in this photo, and so because of that, there really is no purpose for us to have ISO at a high number. If we do, we're going to get a little more graininess than we want. The photo isn't necessarily going to look as clean, and then we have more work to basically do in post. Now, when we look at I apologize, that 100 ISO is going to be better for that image because of the light that's coming in. So there's less work to do in post. It's the flip-flop. It's the inverse. It's a clean image because what we're doing is we're reading the area of which we're shooting, and we're understanding that there's light, And if I have a good amount of light, if I have light sources, I don't necessarily need to turn my light sensitivity up on my physical camera. On the opposite side, the 3200, I have less light. That's when 3200 would come into play. I'm able to get more light out of whatever it is that I'm actually taking a picture of. So let's say that I'm outdoors and it's a very, very dark night. I have one street lamp that's down the block, maybe 100 feet away, and that's my only source of light. Maybe a couple other houses are lit in the area. A high ISO like 3200 might come into handy there, only because now we're in such a dark area and we're in such an unsaturated area of light that now we want our camera to be more receptive to that to help our images. Again, all three of these things that we're talking about today, ISO, f-stop, and shutter speed, they all go hand in hand because typically you have a triangle. Before I say that, auto ISO, when to use it. My best example is I get parents who shoot prom and homecoming photos. Always have auto ISO on. You're going to be going from indoors to outdoors to indoors to outdoors to the physical dance floor to all of the photo shoots. It's important that you use auto ISO when you're doing an event similar to that because you don't really have the time as a photographer to sit there and twiddle with all of your cameras. You have a couple minutes to snap, snap, snap and move on. And so because of that, it's important that you get the best, that you set your ISO to auto so that you have the ability to do that. Now, for some, they might be skilled enough that they can do that on the fly without even thinking, but it's a nice peace of mind as a parent or as a photographer that if you're out and about, using auto ISO or using automatic ISO is a lifesaver, and especially in the sense of taking photos in and outdoors or in different settings where you're moving around everywhere, you're going to different locations. Using the auto ISO will help prevent you from oversaturating an image, making it extra grainy, all this other stuff, to undersaturating an image and making it too dark. That exposure triangle though, and I'll review it here, all three of those things go hand in hand. When shutter speed starts to go up, our image starts to get darker. We're naturally making the image darker because we're closing those shutters fast. ISO then needs to be brought into account because if we're going to be doing that, we want to make sure that we're balancing. How much light are we getting when we use that shutter speed? And how can we compensate for that? What ISO can we use? On the other side of it, now you've got aperture. And while aperture also equates to foreground and background separation, we have to also remember that the iris, or the actual where the blades are for the thing, for the lens, make it small or make it big. And so because of that, we want to make sure that we're setting our aperture, our shutter speed, and our ISO separately, but all in coexistence with each other. Because again, it all translates into the final product. Have your shutter speed too high? You got to make sure you have a good ISO on there too, a high number ISO or a medium number ISO. And you should be looking at your f-stop. Are you using that f-stop to get the subject by itself? Are you blurring the background out? Are you getting the overall composition? All of it is a part of it. All of it's a different factor, and it's important that you understand what that means as you're going. Oh, but to sum up this page, the piggies are a little bit hard to see on here, but if you can see them, when you have an f-stop of f16, you've got your background full and your foreground full. You can see it all. As you move down the road to that f1.4, now you're getting less of the background, which is still a lot of background in the case of these piggies, but you're now getting the piggies in full detail. Moving down to shutter speed, when we do a 1 1,000th of this guy smacking the wood, we can see the hammer is clear in his hand, in the motion, at the 1 1,000th, and as we keep going down the row and get slower and slower, now we get more blur where it's not necessarily getting it in full detail because of how fast the shutters are going. And what I also point out in there, if you look down that row of photos, you're going to notice that 1 1,000th starts very light. or once you get to a half a second, now you're darker. Again, that's what we're talking about when we talk about shutter speed. How fast a camera goes also equates to how much speed or light that it needs. ISO is then your next example. Sorry guys. ISO, when we look at this one, 100 ISO, we've got a nice dark background and we've got our penny in full brass. As we move down the list, the wood behind the penny gets darker or lighter and lighter, and actually as we look at the coin it becomes grainier and grainier because we're turning our ISO up to a point that's going to not benefit our photo. It's going to take away because of how light it already is in the surrounding area. Now the next thing to keep in mind when we're shooting is exposure meter. A lot of people have an exposure meter button on their camera. If you actually look, some people have a dial already on there that's specifically only dedicated to the exposure meter. And others actually have a live viewfinder where they can see the exposure meter and set it. They can also go into their touchscreen LCD and set it there too. Exposure and ISO kind of go hand in hand. ISO is your light, it's how it lightens things up, but it's really how it controls and understands light sensitivity. Exposure meter from there under or overexposes your photo or keeps it perfectly in the middle depending on what you set that as. So when you look, Canon uses 1s and 2s, Nikon uses tick marks, but one stop basically means that you're going one extra movement over in the exposing sense. In this case, what it would be referring to is the camera settings. So way back in the day, when you would have an SLR, you would get a light meter, and the light meter would determine where you were at, and it would show you what type, where your camera was at with what settings, and show you what the exposure rate would be. What now is the case, since we don't use film anymore, is we use this as a way to gauge where we're at if we look at the photo, or do we want to make it darker, do we want to make it lighter, and what you normally can do is actually set it right there. So exposure meter and ISO, very similar, but they're two very different things. Full manual, this gives you control over both the aperture and the shutter speed. Now, why would you want that? This is your experienced, you have good history with the cameras, you know how to use them well, you consider yourself an expert. You might want to use full manual. Someone who's more of a hobbyist, you're intermediate, you don't necessarily have any sort of profession with this, your main goal is to just take fun photos and enjoy the camera, I think that auto would be great. I think shutter would be great. I think that aperture would also be great too. But now the downside to all of that is that when you're doing that, now you're keeping this thing in your mind and you're constantly triple checking and making sure that the camera is performing at the correct settings. When you use full auto, you don't have to do any of that. The camera does all the work for you. You then just decide what you don't like and what you do like. So again, both are great skills, all are valid. Don't let anybody ever tell you that because you use auto you're not a photographer, and don't let anybody tell you that aperture and shutter speed or ISO shouldn't be used at all because the camera can do everything. There's a school of thought for both, and there's a reason for both, and we all fall either in the middle of that spectrum or on one side. We're either so experienced with cameras that we can say you can't trust automatic. Then we're also people who are in the opposite camp who say that automatic will do everything you need it to do and there's no point. So again, you decide for yourself where you sit on that kind of spectrum and how you align yourself with this, but that's something to keep in mind. So at this point, I like to go through some examples. I'll go through this pretty quickly. We're going to talk about f-stop, aperture, and shutter priority to see, f-stop, ISO, and shutter to see if I can figure it all out. ISO for this one, I'm going to probably put it at anywhere between 300 and 400. It's definitely a lower ISO because of how many lights are coming around. There's definitely street lights behind them too, so I'm not as concerned there. The brick has good coloration, everything else. So in my mind, this is a long exposure shot for some period of time. Given that you have the beautiful coloration on the wall, given that you have the nice coloration on the bridge, you don't have a lot of overly dark or overly light points. So I can definitely see some overexposure going on for this, especially with a still image like this. You could easily put a camera and a tripod on there and let it run for 10 seconds and it would take a really clean, beautiful picture. The cherry blossoms, these guys are up close and personal. The background is still pretty legible, so I really wouldn't say that the f-stop is anything small. I probably would say that it's three or four or so. As far as everything else, it's in good detail. It's probably using about 100 to 200 ISO because they're outdoors. And yeah, that's what I would say for this one. So here we have our firefighter gentleman. He's in perfect clear detail. We see his face, we see everything else. He has this grim look on his face, but we see him in perfect clarity. When we look behind him, we can see his counterpart, the additional fireman, but what we don't see is his facial expression. What does this guy look like? We don't see that. And so because of that, they're definitely using a lower number aperture to really center in on this main fireman and black out, or blur out the background, I should say. Now, is the fireman completely gone? Can we still see bits and pieces of him? Absolutely. Like the nose, the eyebrows, the hat. We can tell that he's wearing the same uniform because you can kind of see the orange comlink on his shirt, similar to the fireman behind him. So there are similarities enough that we can tie the two together, but our main focus is drawn towards the gentleman in the front. But yes, ISO is probably kept somewhere around 100 to 200 just to keep it low. It's a good photo. Yeah. The RAM. This RAM is in a lot of detail. When I look at it on the bigger screen, if you guys at home can see it and pull it up on a desktop, it's a pretty big RAM. It's got really beautiful horns, great coloration though. So this was definitely done, I would say in a longer form, not in a too long of a format, not a half a second or so, but this was done slow. The sheep probably wasn't going anywhere, so this was a clean time to take the image. From there, you can see the beautiful coloration on the physical RAM. You can see the beautiful coloration on the horns. There's a little bit of blue on the one side of the horns. Everything's in perfect detail. Now the background's slightly blurred, but not that blurred, so it's probably going to be somewhere around 10. No, sorry. Oh, for ISO. No, no, wait. Background. Oh yeah, no, sorry. F-stop 10. Yeah. I was like, why did I say 10? The f-stop being 10. That's going to slowly start to blur out the background, bring more attention to the foreground, so our RAM is in more detail. We can see the hair on there. We don't have a lot of graininess, so the ISO is probably kept super low. So there's a lot of different things going on in this photo to make it look clean. But like I said, you got to kind of look at each of these photos and thinking with the chart to see how that would be done. Beautiful part about cameras, if you are shooting on automatic, hit the playback button, hit the info button, and it should, if you keep scrolling through, show you how the actual photo was taken and what information was used to get that picture. I always recommend doing that to new photographers, because what happens there is that'll put a little bit of a mindset in your head, where next time you go out, after you were just done taking all these photos, you might then sit there and say, oh wow, I used this ISO, this aperture, and this f-stop for a day just like this 3 weeks ago. Maybe if I set my camera settings to that and I start taking photos, that'll turn out. And before you know it, you're no longer using automatic, you're using all the full settings that your camera has to offer, and you're really getting the best bang for your buck, if you will. Here we have some motion shots. We've got these dogs that are going up to do a catch of some sort with a frisbee. Both are in motion, so we know that the speed of this is probably going to be about a 1 in 1,000th shot, maybe 1 in 1,500ths. Background is blurred, so we know aperture is super low, but color looks great, saturation of the color looks great, and the dogs also look really nice too. Speaking of football, like I did earlier, great example of using good shutter speed. I imagine a diving play in football, they're moving very, very quickly so they don't get tackled. So in this case, I probably would say this is about a 1 in 1,000th or 1 in 1,500ths. Again, anything where we're calling out the speed on this one is great because we're trying to understand how fast do we need to set this camera in order for us to get a shot like this. Background is slightly blurred. It's probably closer to a 2, 2.8, 3, 4. So good separation, but not quite enough that you can't make out the background. You can still see there's a football player on the ground behind him, and there's a football player walking around, so you know that that's there. The bike, the skyline, I would say that this is a longer exposure. You can kind of see where a train went behind the bike there. You can see the motion marks. On top of that too, if you look at the 3 sets of lights, you can see how bright the bulb is and everything else. That's a buildup on time. As things sit and as the overexposure happens, things like the bright light bulbs from the city sidewalks start to over illuminate the light and you get these cool rays. So learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. It's very true. Practice, practice, practice. It's so important, guys. If you're going on a vacation, I don't care how bulky the camera is, you got to figure out a way to bring it. If you're going on a walk and you've never walked an area before and you're doing nothing, bring the camera with you. You're going to a show downtown and they don't allow cameras to be used indoors. Use it before you go indoors. Take a bunch of photos. The only way you're going to get better is to practice. Practice makes perfect, and perfect makes practice. So what I always say, if you're taking 1 photo, take 10 photos. If you're taking 2 photos, take 20 photos. You should always be taking photos in order to learn how to properly use all this stuff. Best camera accessories. Practice, of course. Classes. I have my class. There's workshops everywhere. I've seen so many ads recently for how to do photography in Chicago. What do I need to get into videography and cinematography? I've seen videos and I've seen people go through the whole list of what to do. It's all out there. There's classes you can take, things you can register, things that don't cost you anything, things that cost you $50, things that cost you significant amounts. There's out there. It's all out there. YouTube channels you love, I always recommend strongly find someone on YouTube that you really, really like how they talk, how they explain things, and subscribe and like them. Figure out what they have available and what they have to offer you and use those as tools, tips and tricks to get better at what you love to do, which is take pictures. Workshops are great. I have a lot of people that are part of a club that meets. I have 2 clubs that come in all the time. One is an O'Hare Airport photography group. They take pictures of planes coming and landing. They have special clearance to sit on the runways and do all that. The other one is at the Botanical Gardens. There's a club that does a monthly photo contest at the actual Botanical Gardens gallery section. So there are really cool options out there. There's a lot of things that you can do as a photographer. But again, it comes down to practicing and using your camera. I talk so much, I get so yawny. I know that's why. Practice as much as you can. Take as many photos as you can, because at the end of the day, it is your clear dictator of how you're using the camera and your best educational tool at your disposal. Recommended accessories, things that I tell every person to get. A bag. That's a first starter. Got to have a place to put everything in when you're using it. Extra battery and memory card. You should always, 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 always have an extra battery. I've had way too many times where I have been out shooting and my battery dies and I don't have anything left. My favorite example, Washington, D.C. I visited for 4 days, 3 days, and while I was there, one of the things that I goofed up on was I went to go to one of the monuments to take photos, and right when I got to the Smithsonian, my mirrorless camera's battery died, and so I literally, for the rest of that interior moment at the museum, had to just use my phone. Now, could I have walked a couple miles to go get my extra battery and then come back? Yes. But the amount of time that would have taken, if I would have just kept the extra battery on hand with me as I was going and shooting, because I had already had a day at Arlington Cemetery, I was out front of the White House, I was at the Library of Congress, like I checked all the boxes and made it to the Smithsonian, only to have my battery die there. Have an extra battery. Have an extra memory card. It's important. Lens cleaning kits, I can't recommend it enough. If you're a sports photographer, if you're doing this for your kids are messy, kids are gross, have the cleaning kit so you're able to clean that up, wash it off. Have a strap, have a tripod. They're great. Strap keeps it around your neck. It's centralized. It's a lot harder for someone to try to take your camera away from you if they're a bad person. If you have a strap around your neck, it makes it harder. Also, too, when you're shooting, a tip or trick that I give is, let's say you got the camera pointed out this way. If you tug on the strap, it'll tighten around the neck, and when it does that, it'll allow for a little extra stability. You lock those elbows in, and then you hold that camera in front of you, pull on it, strap is nice and tight. You're going to have a better stability, especially if you have shakier hands, than if you didn't do something like that. Tripod eliminates all of it. You get a tripod, you don't even need to worry about steadiness or keeping things stabilized. External hard drives help you save everything, definitely worth it. Polarized filter, ND filters, both are different things that you can screw onto the lens to alter the pictures, and alter glare, alter reflection, even alter color if that's something you're interested in. And then additional lenses. We'll talk a little bit more at the very end about additional lenses and what I think on those, but what I always recommend, buy a kit if it's your first camera, get something that's basic, and then from there, take a look and see what it is that you want to get out of the camera. What is it that what you currently have isn't fitting the mold for you? Then you can start to figure it out. If you are brand new and you just want to come in and buy a body and multiple lenses and figure it all out, I won't stop you. I wouldn't stop anybody from doing it. But I would probably raise some questions and say, hey, what are you using this for? Is it your first time? Let's put this into perspective. Date your body, marry your glass. Remember that your body is, I like to say, throwawayable. Your body might feel like the bread and butter of your camera because it's what hosts the brain and what connects everything to your SD card and what gets the final result. But the lens itself has the glass that is truly sought after. So no matter what lens you're looking at, if you had let's say $2,000 to put towards the camera, I probably would tell you to put $1,300 towards a lens and $700 towards a body. Only reason being is because the lens will outlive that body if it's taken good care of, versus a phone. We really just have to keep it on. Oh, no, not the phone, sorry. The lens will stay intact for a longer period. The glass will be transferable from the product to another product, versus the body itself, that will start to deteriorate over time. The shutter will start to slow down. The processor will start to slow down. New technology will become available. So things start to happen. People talk about it all the time. When you look at a physical camera, if you go into the settings, you can look at the shutter count. Some people equate shutter count to miles on a car. The amount of miles that you have in a car will dictate how long that car is going to perform for. Once you get to that 200,000, 300,000 miles, that's where your car starts to really die on itself, right? Cameras are kind of the same way. As soon as you get to a certain shutter point, maybe let's say, I don't even know, 2 million shots, it should tell you that there's 2 million times that the shutter went off. That's a clear example that you probably should be looking at a new body. But if you put the money into the lens, you don't have to rebuy lenses. You don't have to try to get lenses to fit with whatever it is. As long as you stick within your same system your same ecosystem of lenses or of cameras, you're totally fine. So for example, Sony's never changed their mount. So you invest in a heavy-duty Sony GM lens and you attach it to a body, you'll be able to move that across the board to any other Sony cameras. Let's say that you're doing a Canon camera. If you do a Canon camera and you buy a Canon lens that costs $2,500, you'll be able to take that Canon lens with you into the next series. Same thing with Nikon, same thing with Fuji, same thing with Panasonic. It's a really nice and important feature with these lenses because it helps prevent you from having to buy brand new things and sell all your old ones. So date your body, marry your glass, sum it up. So now let's talk about lenses, focal length and zoom. So much talking. Focal length equates to zoom, but what focal length means in terms of zoom is the perspective at which we have on the image. The lower the number, the wider the angle will be. The higher the number, the tighter the angle will be. The tighter it becomes, the more it fits the image into frame, giving us the impression of zoom. Same thing as when we have a small number. We have an impression of wide angle because that is what the camera's fitting into your frame. So at 70 millimeters, we can't see the geese or we can't see the swans in the distance. At 105, we're getting closer. We have less water space. We have less filler. Now we're getting closer to the birds. At 200, we can see the birds pretty clear. Less water, more land. And then as we keep going to 400, all birds, less land on both ends, and still a decent amount of water. Easy way to look at it, easy way to think about it. The lower the number, the wider out your hands can go. The smaller, the higher the number, the tighter your hands go. Focal length and compression, how we understand that. When we look at focal length, it's important to remember that the smaller the number, the skinnier the person will look, the higher the number, the chunkier the person will look. Is that a bad thing? No. Just depends on what we're trying to do here. Again, I wouldn't want to use a wide angle for portrait photography. I would want to use a wide angle for scenery, for landscape, for architecture-based photography. I would want to use a 50 to 85, maybe even 100 for a portrait photography because then I get a clean, good, detailed image. Why would I want to use something like 200 to 600 millimeters? Zoom. It's for I want the capability of zooming as far out as possible while retaining the same level of quality that this camera offers me. That's what a zoom lens, in a sense, will basically give you versus something that has a wider or smaller angle. And it's important to keep in mind compression when it comes to people because some people become very offended if you take a photo that isn't the most flattering. So a lot of the times it has nothing to do with them. It has to do with the lens that you're using. What lenses do you need? The kit lens is a great lens. I strongly recommend it. It has everything that you need to get started. If it's a 16 to 50 millimeter, you've got wide angle to portrait. If it is a 18 to 135, it's more of an all-in-one. You get some zoom, some not. Canon likes to make a 24 to 105 that I really like. I recommend it all the time as a kit. I've also seen 24 to 135. Great lens as well, powerful. Focal or prime lenses, those are available too. But in my reality of it, I think that if you're past your kit lens, you need 3 lenses, and I will break those down for you. So kit lenses first, that's what you get out of the box. This is an 18 to 55 Nikon lens. This is one that I actually have for my D5600. Great camera, great intro level for me. I use it as a beater camera when I need to go do things where it might be a little rough around the edges. My camera might take a beating. Next lens up I always recommend is the Nifty 50. One of my personal favorite lenses. 50 millimeters is an unbridled, perfect portrait lens. If you are someone who's interested in taking portraiture photography of people, of dogs, of statues, of Birds, you want a 50mm lens. It's going to do everything that you need it to do just with no zoom, but the quality of a 1.8 or a 1.4 is typically unmatched by anything else. So strongly would recommend, if you're looking to add something to your arsenal as far as lenses is concerned, a nifty 50 is great. The kit lens is one of them, but now that I just mentioned that, I know I said it probably earlier, what is the difference between something like a prime lens and a zoom lens? It's all in the name. Prime is one standard number, and the way that I tell people about it is that it'll have a better f-stop, so 1.4, 1.8, because it's non-variable, it doesn't move around. So the manufacturers can make the glass to a point where it'll give you that consistent f-stop of 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, some of the lowest numbers every time. Versus a zoom lens, there's two options. You can get a cheaper zoom lens, which will usually give you an f-stop between 3 and it'll go all the way up to 6. And as you zoom, the lowest f-stop that's available will become the next f-stop. So if it says that for example, that's probably a 100 to 400mm lens. Let's say that at 100 it's 3.5. Well, now you're at 150 now, 150mm. Now it's probably a 4. Now you're at 200mm. Now it's probably at a 4.5. And so on and so forth until it gets to the highest number, that being 6 at the most extended, which would be 400mm. Now, there are other lenses that have a 2.8 continuous throughout the entire lens. And that's typically what you're going to see when it comes to the zoom lenses, is a 2.8, 2.8 or higher. Now this is what the Trinity looks like. So what I put on here, a nifty 50 is one of them. That is what's supposed to be the bottom right corner, and I know it's not. It's a 24 to 70, I believe, but that's meant to be a 50mm prime lens. Again, the best lens that, in my opinion, because I'm a portrait photographer, I think it's the best way to go. Above that, you've got into 16 to 35. That's a great way to get a good lens that offers you just about the same amount that the 50 will do, but the 50 will be better for that portrait photography where you're taking pictures of people, whereas the 16 to 35 is going to be great for your wide angles. That's going to give you your more depth of field going this way, and then tighten you up a little bit at 35, maybe bring you like right around there, where you can still have some form of wide angle perspective, but not nearly as much as the 16. And then just below that is our big telephoto guy. We've got a 70 to 200 down there. Now that's a beast of a lens, but why use that? Just what we saw with the geese that we were looking at, or the swans in that one photo. A lot of wildlife photographers, a lot of sports photographers, because of the distance that they have to stay back from whatever animal they're taking pictures of, or from whatever player they're taking pictures of, zoom lenses are extremely important and valuable to their work. But if you're going to do it, get these 3 lenses. And then last but not least, the travel lens. I said that we have a 24 to 105, but a great example is this 18 to 135 by Nikon. It's a great lens, but what's awesome about it, what I like about it, is that it doesn't necessarily have the best f-stop, but it does everything. So it gives you wide angle. It's going to give you portrait. It's going to zoom a little bit. It's going to be able to give you some macro photography. You're going to be able to get decent light on it, depending on what you got. The f-stop is the only tricky part, and there's not a lot of ways around that. But if you're resourceful, you can always blur, post. You can do other fixtures to make the image look better. But an 18 to 135 or an 18 to 200, whatever this lens is a great lens for you to have if, let's say, you are trying to travel light and you don't have the room to bring all 3 of your other lenses. Travel lens, while it might not have the best apertures and f-stops, or aperture f-stop, it's still going to be a powerful lens that gives you good flexibility. And that's it. Holy cow. I think this might be one of the fastest classes I've told for this. I'm usually here past 7 o'clock, but Nobody's in class with me today, so it moved a little bit quicker. I apologize for being a little sleepy today. It's hard to have when I have nobody in front of me. I get a little lightheaded. But regardless, thanks for everybody for being here for this. I appreciate y'all. My name is Saxon. I work here in the camera department at Apt. I work in the small electronics. So if you guys ever have any questions about cameras or drones or comments for me, obviously you can chat in the live chat right now. I'm going to stay online for probably till about 7 to answer any more questions if they come in, which none have. But basic drones are going to be not next Thursday, but the following Thursday. So let me break out my calendar. So the 19th we are off. Next Thursday, no class. The 26th we will have our class. That'll be for drones, basics on the drones. Last Thursday of each month. My email's at the bottom there, saxon.katowski@app.com. You got my direct phone line, 847-544-2716. Again, anything that you guys need, any comments, any questions, any concerns for me, please feel free to type it in, chat, email, or call me. My only days off are Tuesday, Wednesday, so if you want to come into the store to see me directly, just let me know. And what I tell customers all the time, too, I get a lot of people who ask, can we just get a one-on-one from you, trained, whatever, pay? I'm like, no, there's no reason to pay. You don't have to sign up for anything. That third Thursday of the month, if there's another Thursday that's not necessarily right before about 5 o'clock or at 5 o'clock or beyond, by all means, come in and pick my brain. I am always here to answer questions. I'm always here to make sure that you got the right information. And if there's products that I think would be better for you, even if we don't carry them, I'll find out a way to help you get them. So whether that's, I'll leave that up to determination and imagination to understand. But yeah. All right. Thanks for being here, guys. I'm going to walk to go do one thing real quick here in the room. Stay online. If you have any questions, just chat them, and then I will respond in just a moment. I'm going to get rid of this water bottle. I'll be right back. Alright. One thing I learned about this room is there's no garbage cans. I appreciate everybody for getting on these videos. Sorry about last week for not having sound with them. And again, sorry for being a little sleepy today. It's one of those things when I'm just talking in the midair and I have nobody to talk to or to kind of catch my eye or to at least hold me accountable. It's like I get a little lightheaded. I'm like, oh. Every time, a couple times I've been seen on camera sipping a coffee, and that usually helps get me through. But sometimes you get into some of these conversations and it's just, I've said these things so many times over and over again that I'm like, oh man, I'm sleepy. But I'd say big takeaways to remember today. You've got the exposure triangle. That's an important thing to keep in mind when shooting. What I probably would recommend for people who are trying to wean themselves off automatic and do something different, start with the priorities. Start with aperture or shutter priority. Learn those really well. I personally love shutter priority. I could care less about foreground to background separation. In most cases, when I'm shooting with a 35 prime lens, or I'm shooting with a really nice 18 to 55 millimeter, which has a continuous f-stop of 2.8. Great lens, powerful lens. I've got that 35 millimeter. That's, I believe, a 2.8 as well. I shoot on Fujifilm as my camera of choice. I also have a Nikon as well too, and other cameras that are film based in my collection. But when I'm shooting, I'm really looking for how fast an object's moving. That's the first thing that captures in my mind, because I'm obsessed with motion and capturing motion. And so for me, I have plenty of photos that I submit for whatever purposes I need to submit them that are very blurry sometimes. Why I submit them is because it offers me some sort of what's the term? I'd say artistic freedom or artistic liberty, where I'm able to then look at something and say, just because there's blur or just because there's motion in here and you can visibly see it, doesn't necessarily diminish its quality as a photo. Again, we think of photos as a 2D surface of something, of us capturing a moment, and a lot of the times I think what we forget is that moments involve movement for the most part to get to whatever it is that it is. So yeah, don't be afraid of motion, don't be afraid of blur. If anything, see what you like about the blur and what you don't like about the blur. If it's all blurry, obviously there's room for improvement. But if you're taking sports photography and the legs are blurry, let's say because the person's running, it's like, what do I need then? What's my issue here? How do I get rid of that? And that's just all practice. So if you're trying to get off of automatic and you're weaning yourself, I probably would recommend start with shutter priority or aperture priority, whatever makes the most sense to you. As far as lenses go, go at your own pace. I don't think that necessarily everybody needs to buy all three at once. You don't need to get your prime lens, your semi-telephoto, and your magnification telephoto lenses right off the bat. Some people like myself, I really don't have a reason to get a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. Would I like one? Of course. But do I need one? No. So what I always say is, buy the lenses for what you're using them for. Marry the glass that you're getting and date that body, so that way in the future when the next body comes out, you've got gorgeous glass to move over. If you have let's say $1,000 to spend, I would say, if you can, put $450 towards that body and put the other $550 towards the lens. That's kind of unheard of right now. I don't know many camera bodies that are selling for that cheap for $450. You're probably looking at more like a $2,000 camera, and in that case I'd probably tell you to put $1,200 towards the lens, $800 towards the camera body. That's a reasonable thing to do, where now you're really putting more effort into the glass, getting the best glass for the best budget that you have, and then getting a body which will take a phenomenal photo, do detail, do all this stuff, but then eventually 5, 6, 7, 8 years down the road, when you're starting to see that your camera's at its last wits, you can then upgrade into something else and move those lenses over. So great options. All right, folks. Well, I appreciate everybody. That was my hour and a half. Thank you all. Happy shooting to everybody, and I will see everybody on January 26th, so 2 weeks from now, for Basics on Drones.